So lots to talk about. Let's join our panel. Joining me from Beijing is Yong Wang. He is an associate professor of economics at Peking University. With us too from Shanghai is Xiankun. He is a former senior WTO negotiator for China. And joining us from London is Torrens. He's a senior partner at Controlled Risks, a company that works on Chinese business growth in Europe and Africa. And joining us from Boise, Idaho here in the US is Meyer. He is emeritus professor of management from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome all of you to the show. Let's go to Beijing first. Yong Wang, perhaps for our global audience, can you describe to us what is an SOE and what is all the reform that China and the world needs to know about?
Okay, so SOE reform have been going on for quite a while. I think the remarkable progress was made in the late 1990s, where a lot of small and medium-sized state-owned enterprises were restructured, and many of them, in fact, went bankrupt. So most of these firms are actually in the downstream sectors. Basically just manufacturing goods for consumption and consumption services, hotel, restaurants, so on and so forth. So SOEs were exiting from those downstream sectors. However, the upstream sectors, like energy, financial services, telecommunications, these key upstream sectors are still dominated by state-owned enterprises. So in the late 1990s, there were this SOE reforms, so-called grasp the large and let go small, and we see a lot of SOEs basically disappear. But this vertical structure emerged after 2001. So downstream sectors are mainly dominated by private firms, foreign or domestic, free entry, whereas upstream sectors are mainly dominated still by state-owned enterprises. And last few years, we see the consolidations of SOEs. So SOE become larger and larger. And we also hear about this discussion on mixed ownership reforms about SOEs. I think there are a lot of difficulties.
Torrens, you deal a lot with SOEs as they expand across the world. What's your experience in dealing with these Chinese champions? Are they bloated? Are they in need of reform? How do they shape up to other global companies?
Well, our experience of working with the Chinese state sector has largely been around energy and infrastructure. And obviously we're dealing with very large organizations. We certainly don't find them to be bloated or inefficient. They are, however, still quite centralized, but increasingly they're getting a global mindset. I mean, it's relatively early days for a lot of these companies, so they're really learning how to invest and operate overseas in sometimes quite unfamiliar markets. So I think that process of sort of internationalization and streamlining and gaining experience and knowledge is an ongoing one.
Have you seen reform gather pace since you've obviously been working over a decade?
Yeah, I mean, I was working in China in the late 90s and was struck by the efforts to transform the financial sector and to try and remove bad debt from the system there. And at the time, it seemed like a hopeless task, but it's been largely achieved. So I think it's important to remember, as Yong Wang said, that this state sector reform has been going on for decades. It's not something that's been prompted by criticism from President Trump or criticism of the Made in China policy. This is something that China knows it it must do.
Yeah, that's a good way to get into Marshall in Boise, Idaho, because when you look at the headlines, and there's this big push by the Trump administration for the Chinese economy to open up more and to reform as far as they're concerned, people might be forgiven of thinking this is a reaction to what Washington wants. Is Washington's perception of the Chinese economy a little bit behind, do you think?
Maybe a little bit. What's interesting is that SOE reform as mentioned, it's been an ongoing project. The end of last year, SESEC announced that reform is complete. Now we have a new round of reform. So clearly, there are lots of issues and challenges in China. The perception, which I think is your question, is that SOEs are competing unfairly against Western corporations, against U.S. firms. I'm not sure you can accuse them of being unfair if they're a little inefficient. It is clear that SOEs have preferential access to credit. And it's clear also that despite all the efforts to make them more market-like, more competitive, they're often stuck in their histories. So it remains, I think, a bit of a challenge.
Let's go to Shanghai now, because obviously you've worked as a WTO negotiator for China. How do SOEs fit into the world trading system? Because obviously they do have public backing, other countries have them as well, but then of course there are all these rules about free market as well. How does the SOEs fit into the sort of global economic architecture?
In WTO, there are two aspects of work that are related to SOEs. The first one is, of course, what we call rulemaking. In existing WTO legislation, there are no specific rules governing the SOEs per se, except that WTO does have a rule, has a provision, Article 17, which governs so-called state trading enterprises, so SDEs. That could include both state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, which are accorded with privileges.
Liu Xiankun, can I ask you a follow-up question in that, do you think that as people start talking about reforming the WTO and including it for sort of 21st century economy, that there will be more attention on rules of the road when it comes to state-owned enterprises in China and elsewhere? That seems to be somewhere where Washington and Europe wants to push it too.
Oh, well, actually, that kind of debate is already there and is quite heated. And in the China's trade policy review, which was concluded just last month, and there was a heated debate on whether the so-called state role in China's economy is undermining the interests of other members and also violating Chinese accession commitments and its obligations. And of course, a lot of members pointed at the state-owned enterprises as a kind of source of concern for them. So I think the discussion is also there. But on the other hand, of course, some members like the US, EU, and Japan has twice brought this issue to the global attention by tabling a joint statement pointing at SOEs among some of the issues as a kind of source of concern and which they think should be brought into the discussion or even rulemaking of the WTO in the future. So those are the things we have been witnessing in the organization.
Going back to Beijing and Yong Wang, I want to ask you how this reform of the state-owned enterprises affects China's overall economic plan to become a middle-income country, then a fully industrialized country as well. Is it helping deliver rising earnings and profitability, and how's it going to sort of help avoid the middle-income trap for China?
Okay, so right, I think this is an important question. As you know, that last year, China's GDP per capita is around $640 US dollars. So it is already a middle-high income country. I think SOE reforms is crucial for China in order to escape the so-called middle-income trap. And the reason is that China features this vertical structure, namely the downstream sectors, the consumption, manufacturing, and consumption service. These are liberalized and fairly competitive. There are a lot of entry, competition, and domestic, foreign, private firms are competing. It's very effective and actually also is a tradable sector. But the upstream sector, some of the key upstream sectors, like the financial sector, the energy, telecommunications. These sectors are still dominated by SOEs with certain degree of administrative monopoly power. So when China tried to move from the middle income status to high income status, now China's labor cost rises, land cost rises, and exchange rate also appreciate, which means the downstream private firm face increasingly high production costs. It's at this critical moment, if the upstream sectors do not improve the productivity and hence lower the price of these intermediate imports and intermediate services like financial services, that are going to choke off the growth of the whole downstream private sector. So the SOEs, remaining SOEs, are mainly staying in the upstream sectors. So which means that the upstream remaining SOEs in the upstream sectors, if they fail to increase the productivity, hence lower the prices of their products, that will be fatal to the whole economy. We're not just talking about profitability of these individual firms, these SOEs. This really have a global impact on whole economy of China. Okay. So in short, I believe that so SOEs in the upstream sector need to reform, and some of the upstream sectors need to lower the entry barrier and allow private firms to enter, so they enhance competition, which can help lower the production cost of the upstream sector. That's going to be helpful for the downstream sector of China, and hence that will help China escape the middle income trap.
Well, strong words there, potentially fatal if the reform doesn't work. Marshall Meyer is from outside looking into China. Do you agree? What needs to be done, and are the stakes this high?
Oh, the stakes are extremely high. One of my concerns here is the term reform. What do we mean by reform? It used to be, let's make Chinese firms look like Western firms, right? More efficiency, more productivity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But almost all this discussion is top-down. We're going to change the ownership, or we're going to change the competitive landscape, or we're going to change the top management incentives. And what I'm wondering about is whether a bottom-up process could also be very, very effective. Remember, China has set national goals for innovation. And a question is, how do you turn all Chinese firms, but especially the large state enterprises, into incredibly innovative firms? And it almost seems oxymoronic, but I think it can be done. Let me give you an illustration. The firm's not an SOE, but it's very well known in China, and it's a firm I've followed pretty closely. It's called the Meyer Group.
Very
I think
famous,
all of you know of it.
Yep, it took over GE's appliance division here in the US, didn't it?
Exactly, exactly. And I followed that very, very closely. And guess what? The CEO of GE Appliances is also co-CTO, Chief Technology Officer of the Meyer Group. And why is that? He's a product person, he's an engineer, and most importantly, he's developed a very low-cost, very effective innovation model. It's called First Build down in Louisville, Kentucky. And the remarkable thing is that it takes products to market at practically zero cost. I won't go into the details, but I can assure you the folks in Qingdao are watching this quite closely.
Yeah, as are many American conglomerates as well. It's a fascinating story, and people should go to Louisville, Kentucky. But let's go to London. Chris, in terms of this reform and SOEs as they roll out across the globe, especially in Africa and Europe, what sort of effect are they having in terms of the domestic economies there? Because some of them are quite large, they bring a lot of capital with them as well. Are they learning efficiencies on the way, or is it very much an arm of the state still?
Well, I think they're gaining international experience. I'm not sure if they're learning efficiencies on the way. I mean, obviously they're initially welcomed by many of the host countries because they're bringing much needed infrastructure or exploitation of local resources without perhaps some of the strings attached from Western governments or Western businesses. But there's also growing concern among some of those host countries about the indebtedness that they could get themselves into. And so they're looking at many of these Chinese SOEs and wondering about those companies' efficiencies and how they're run back home. So I think there's still a long way for many of these SOEs to go, but we can still expect those in the, as Yong Wang said, in the sort of upstream sector side of things to remain state-owned, I think, because they're in strategically important sectors. And as we've seen in the West, governments do hold on to strategically, they do retain control of strategically important sectors. So I suppose the question is how, in the much longer term, Liu He and others in the sort of policy-making side of things in Beijing are going to address this issue. But I would fully expect the bigger, really global multinationals, even in the state sector, to gain efficiencies and to weave in some of that technological innovation that Marshall was talking about as well.
Yeah, Yong Wang in Beijing, bigger and stronger, more competitive. That's raised the ire of Washington, especially as at the 19th Party Congress, talking about global competitive companies in very competitive areas like semiconductors, for example, biomedical science going forward. These are two very different models for the industries of tomorrow.
So, yeah, certainly, I think this current sort of trade war between Washington and Beijing, an important part of it is about this large state-owned enterprises in those sectors. So if we look at the innovation and also technology, it is clear that in China, it's still mainly the upstream SOEs receive the largest share of R&D subsidies, and now they are forging forward. I think while some of the upstream sectors is indeed a sort of strategic sector, it's related to national defense, etc. So it is justifiable to have more state control. But on the other hand, I think the R&D efficiency could have been very much improved by really, diverting more R&D subsidies to downstream sectors. So now, if you see the large SOEs, in China, they on the one hand receive a lot of subsidy R&D. On the other hand, also they try to going out and competing with other large firms internationally. That can easily lead to some controversies and to say whether this is really just these firms gain unfair advantages because they're backed by the state.
Xiankun in Shanghai, is there a danger as the sort of different economic models battle with one another, Washington and Beijing, that sort of the global financial architecture sort of gets left behind in a sort of very 20th century way? There must be a lot of debate at the WTO and with your former colleagues about how sort of you keep up and accommodate different views of these companies and how they operate on a global platform.
In the WTO discussion, I mean, the delegates are less concerned about the ownership of forms. That is to say, the SOEs per se is not a source of concern. It's just different form of organization or ownership.
Right.
On the other hand, people are more concerned about how the SOEs are managed. I mean, how they operate. Do they operate on a commercial basis? And do they receive government subsidies, as some other panelists have pointed out? Or do they constitute a de facto unfair competition against other non-state players and hence undermine the interests of the trading partners? So those are the kind of focus of debate in the WTO. In the future of the kind of discussion and also potential rulemaking of this issue, I think that it is important to focus on not on the ownership, but on the way that such SOEs operate. I think that's the most important source of kind of problem solution. On the other hand, I think that this is just one part of the picture. The other side of the picture is that right now what we have witnessed is a kind of global fear of SOEs, including Chinese ones, such as the investment in host countries. Okay. And some of the recent actions by some members to prohibit or to constrain the investment from China is solely based on the fact that the investor is a SOE, instead of whether that SOE is operating on a commercial basis or not. So I think there are kind of different aspects of the same issue that we should try to manage in the global community and such as in the WTO.
Marshall, that's a really interesting point, isn't it? That the US is moving to sort of regulate Chinese investment far more here in the US because of accusations of state subsidies and cherry picking the technologies of tomorrow with state backing. How do you see this affecting China's model?
It's very interesting because it's clear that CFIUS and other agencies are going to look much more closely at Chinese investments of all sorts.
That's the Committee for Foreign Investment in the US. Yeah, sorry. I just want to say that's the Committee for Foreign Investment in the US, which is basically the body that looks into investments. Carry on.
Right. So I think the Chinese strategy in response to this is likely to be, US is, what today, 22% of the global economy, which means there's another 78%. And they'll direct their investment elsewhere if necessary. Look what's happened, for example, in the telecoms. We just woke up and discovered that Apple is number 3. I think Huawei has surpassed Apple in terms of handset sales.
Yeah, Chris in London, do you see that? Do you see, obviously, you know, there's a fixation here on Washington between the two biggest economies in the world and their trading pattern, but are we ignoring the fact that Chinese SOEs are pushing all over the globe, regardless of the trade tensions with the US and the different economic models for the 21st century economy?
Yeah, they are pushing globally. I mean, I think they're still going to try and crack the US market, as it were, but there's certainly a lot of debate in the EU about the role of the state in Chinese SOE. So I think it's up to perhaps the Chinese government to address this issue and perhaps to strike a balance in its foreign economic policy in terms of state-led capitalism. And I think there's a kind of messaging piece as we grow more familiar with these Chinese companies, many of whom many host countries have never heard of. I think things will get easier for Chinese SOEs as their familiarity in foreign markets grows and as they become more familiar and more well known, and the sort of initial suspicion, I think, which is bred from ignorance about Chinese investment begins to dissipate, and host countries in the EU and even in the US become more comfortable with the concept of Chinese investment. But Beijing's really got to address this worry around state-led capitalism and the notion that somehow this investment is that they have an unfair advantage.
Yeah, marketing and PR as important as the actual businesses themselves. Thanks so much from London. We also want to thank our guests in Shanghai and Beijing, and of course not forgetting Boise, Idaho as well. That's it, another edition of The Heat. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Nathan King. See you next time.